Hello, everyone. My name is Brendan Marr. That noise you're hearing is my ventilator. And welcome to Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. Today is my birthday. And like a hobbit, I'm going to give out gifts on my birthday. And my gift to you is this podcast. This episode, today, we're going to talk about George Lucas and the auteur theory of cinema. Now, what is the auteur theory of cinema, you may ask? Auteur is the French word for author. The auteur theory posits the idea that a director is author of his film, or her film, as the case may be. And how does this apply to Star Wars? That George Lucas is the auteur of the first 6 films in the Star Wars saga. Now, I saw the movie Judy yesterday, and it got me thinking about the old Hollywood studio system. Back in those days, it was very hard, or it was very different than what we're used to today. Not always true, but in general. Nowadays, and especially in the 70s, the idea of a director basically writing their film and being the author of it became the norm, or the normal way things were. In the old studio days, that wasn't that way. Except for maybe a couple of directors, like Charlie Chaplin and John Ford and Alfred Hitchcock. But in general, the studios ruled the roost. For example, Gone with the Wind is not an auteur statement, at least in my opinion, by director Victor Fleming. And if you want to know more, you can look up the fact that the movie had 3 or 4 directors. Long story. But in my view, the film is not an auteur statement by Victor Fleming. It is more of an auteur statement by studio bigwig David O. Selznick. Kind of like how you could argue that Kevin Feige is the auteur of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I'm not willing to say that that is the case, but you could make a strong argument for that. Even though he has not directed any of them, his hand is in them. Walt Disney, you may find it hard to believe, never directed any Disney movie. Yet when we think of those movies, we think of Walt Disney. So let's jump to George Lucas. George Lucas was part of a generation of filmmakers that were now able to pursue their visions without the studio necessarily stepping in and messing with it. Now, the studio would still be a problem. They would still come in and say, we don't like that. When they would see the finished product, they would say, change that. Or we're going to cut out that part of the movie. Which they did to THX 1138 and American Graffiti, which were George Lucas's first two films. However, during the making of these movies, the studios generally did not interfere. And the directors of that time period, known generally as New Hollywood, or the New Wave cinema, were really allowed to explore their visions as artists, and George Lucas was one of them. We know the stories of the making of Star Wars. George was able to make the movie he wanted, even with pushback from the crew, and even the studio having long drawn-out meetings with Alan Ladd Jr., who was championing Star Wars. But the filming generally proceeded the way George Lucas wanted it to. Now you may say, but isn't it true that George wanted to do some stuff and people said no, and Star Wars is better for that? Well, that's kind of true. But George Lucas at the time, when he was writing the script, recognized the limitations, whether financial or technical, and made a lot of his own self-corrections. If you want to know more, read How Star Wars Conquered the Universe. But generally, he was able to make the film the way he wanted to, at least within the confines of what was available at the time. The film, as we know, was a resounding success. One of the greatest successes in film history. And thankfully, the creation of Star Wars was due to that era of filmmaking. Now, the auteur theory is not accepted by everyone, and that is why it is termed a theory. The argument against it is that it denies the collaborative nature of film. Let's take Star Wars, for example. It is George Lucas's film, but one particular note is the editing. Marcia Lucas, who was George's wife at the time, Paul Hirsch and Richard Chew were hired to correct the first edit of the film. The first edit was a disaster, and if that had been shown, Star Wars would have sunk. These three editors came in and saved it. There is a YouTube video called How Star Wars Was Saved in the Edit. I would highly recommend it. So you can argue that these editors were as much a part of the artistic product as George Lucas was. So yes, there is some pushback about the auteur theory. And Star Wars, you could find some examples there of where you could argue against it being the auteur, just the artistic statement of just George Lucas. That brings us to The Empire Strikes Back. Now, I believed for a long time, as did many fans, that George was not very involved with The Empire Strikes Back. Well, I'm going to tell you that that is false. He was very involved. He did not go to the set very often. But mark my words when I tell you that he was very involved. On the script level, on the post-production level, George Lucas was extremely involved in the story and the creation. So even though it is directed by the late Irving Kershner, you could argue it is still George Lucas's film as an auteur. Now, it is believed that George Lucas wanted to basically be a backseat driver of The Empire Strikes Back. But Kershner proved to be more of an skilled independent director than Lucas had intended. There are no stories of any enmity between the two or any moments where they clashed. But suffice to say, Kershner didn't prove that easy to control. As far as he was still extremely involved and basically directed the film the way that he was being led to, without George necessarily being basically a specter over Kershner's shoulder, saying, do this, do that, do this, do that. Maybe it's also because Kershner was one of Lucas's former teachers at the University of Southern California. So maybe he was able to command more respect from George. For George to kind of back off and let Kershner handle it. But George was extremely involved with the making of this film. And for the argument that is his story, co-written by him and Lawrence Kasdan, with the story ideas from George, that it is his movie. That brings us, of course, to Return of the Jedi. Lucas was basically co-director. Even though the late Richard Marquand directed the film and is credited as director, all you need to look at is behind-the-scenes video to see that Lucas was basically co-director. If not, you could argue that he was in complete control of the film, even with Marquand directing. Yet again, read how Star Wars conquered the universe. So George Lucas is back, and in many ways overshadowed Marquand as director. And suffice to say, Return of the Jedi is George Lucas's film. The prequels, as we know, were all written and directed by George. Therefore, they are his films. George Lucas is an auteur. Now, I've told this story before, but it bears repeating. I was extremely critical of George Lucas for many years. And still am, to a degree, of his control of the prequels. That being said, as an auteur, George Lucas made the film he wanted to make. Now, it is tricky when you're making films with a large fan base, because you want to please the fans, but you don't want to go so far as to sacrifice your artistic vision just for them. Now, you can argue that George Lucas doesn't care about the fans. Maybe so. But I am not here to tell you what you need to think about them. They are the stories he wanted to tell. And therefore, you can take them or leave them. Now, I have come around over the years to accepting what came about in the prequels. That being said, the 6 Star Wars films of that era are the auteur statements of George Lucas at least in my opinion. As I mentioned, the auteur theory is not accepted by everyone. Therefore, it could be argued that the auteur theory does not really exist at all, or does not apply to Star Wars. Let me know what you think. But those are my thoughts on the auteur theory and George Lucas. My name is Brendan Marr. That noise you're hearing is my ventilator. And thank you for tuning in to Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. May the Force be with you.